Hello, everybody. Welcome to our first webinar for the Fleet Management Awareness Month. Excited to have everybody on the line today. My name is Kim Sager. I'm going to be helping to host the webinar today. We have two presenters, Scott Conlon and Fabian Cardona. First, some logistics about the webinar. This is a recorded webinar. It will be posted on our MPMA YouTube account once we are finished. We are going to save questions for the end. So if you have a question during the webinar, you can post it in the chat window, or once we're doing question and answer, you can raise your hand. Also, if you are sitting currently in a room with others listening to the webinar presentation today, and you are an MPMA member, you can receive CEU credits even though you are not signed in. You just need to email me at the vpmarketing@mpma.org, and we will get your credits. So first, I would like to introduce our presenters. Give you a brief bio. Scott is a senior manager at Mercury Associates, which is the largest dedicated fleet management consulting firm in the world. Scott previously served as the equipment manager section chief for Montgomery County, Maryland, and is certified federal fleet manager through the MPMA Federal Fleet Training and Certification Program. Scott, welcome.
Thank you.
Fabian is a retired Air Force fleet manager where he had responsibility for a wide variety of equipment types. Also, prior to joining Mercury as a senior consultant, Fabian worked for Penske Truck Leasing as a contractor supporting the implementation of the Defense Property Accountability System Maintenance and Utilization module as the Air Force Fleet Management Information System. Welcome, Fabian.
Thank you.
So we will go ahead and get started. I will turn over to Scott.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thank you for the introduction, and Kim, also for all the work that has gone into this year's Fleet Management Awareness Month preparations. And before we begin, I also want to thank our audience out there for taking time out of their day to learn about equipment management in the federal fleet. And we have a lot of material to cover, so without delay, we'll go ahead and get started. So the topic we have today is managing equipment in the federal fleet. Next slide, please. So our overview here shows that we're going to talk about uses for equipment in the federal fleet. What is equipment? We'll go over some terminology. We'll cover equipment fleet management, owning versus leasing or renting equipment. And we're going to cover a recently published study that was done by the Government Accountability Office, where they were looking to get an idea of the size and scope of the heavy equipment fleet in the federal government. And then we're going to conclude. Next slide, please. So here's some examples up on the screen of some various types of heavy equipment or equipment in the fleet. The first is, you can see on the left-hand side of the screen that the National Park Service has a lot of types of vehicles, but this one in particular is a tractor that they use to groom snow at Yellowstone. On the right-hand side, you'll see that equipment can be used to transport Marines. This one in particular shows a place called the Mountain Warfare Training Center in Bridgeport, California, where it's a high altitude Arctic warfare training environment, and they use a lot of over the snow type of equipment to move Marines to and from the training areas. Next slide, please. Here we also have aviation support equipment on the left-hand side of the screen. It's a retired Air Force tow tractor that was used to move aircraft around the flight line. And then we also have on the right-hand side of the screen, we have what looks like an aerial work platform that's being used in support of DOE research. where they have some sort of sophisticated scientific type of experiment that they're constructing there, and they're using aerial work platforms to reach various parts of the scientific experiment. Next slide, please. Other examples of heavy equipment used by federal agencies or equipment on the left-hand side is a forklift. This is a material handling equipment piece that's used by DLA. In this specific case, they're using it immediately after Hurricane Harvey to load supplies onto a helicopter. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you see water being distributed by some Coast Guard personnel using, in the bottom part of the screen, you can see that the bed of a Gator off-road utility cart is filled with water bottles that they're using to provide relief down in Puerto Rico. Next slide, please. So generally speaking, when we talk about equipment, we're referring to self-propelled mobile assets, but what we're excluding here is talking about faster portable on-highway vehicles. So those are already covered by a complex management structure in the federal government where vehicles are required to be tracked in agency fleet management information systems, and that information is required to be reported out of those fleet management information systems into a system called FAST, or the Federal Automotive Statistical Tool. And that tool is used to aggregate all the data from across the various agencies to provide a comprehensive warehouse of data to produce the federal fleet report on an annual basis. And the reason why I bring that up is that the types of assets that we're talking about here today, the equipment, are not really covered, they're not covered by the FAST reporting structure. So there's a lot less emphasis placed on data visibility and the management of those types of assets. Additionally, what we're excluding here today are aircraft. Those are also not FAST reportable. They're reported in another system, but we're also excluding marine types of equipment like ships and boats, and also railroad rolling stock. So you can already see that when you start to talk about equipment, things start to get a little bit hazy as far as the terminology that's used to describe what's out there, what the different categories are, and how we come to some common definitions that we can refer to. Next slide, please. So what is equipment? So the definitions that are out there depend upon the agency that's trying to define it and the purpose behind what is their reason for trying to define what equipment is. So we have a couple examples here of various agencies and how they have attempted to define various classes of equipment or categorize various classes of equipment that fall outside of the other categories that I talked about. GSA has a system in place called federal supply classes, but they don't have a common reporting standard like business rules that are used for used in FAST for on-road vehicles. If folks out there are fleet managers, then they're probably familiar with the FAST reporting process that just at least a large data call concluded about 3 or 4 weeks ago, where every on-road asset in the federal fleet had to be reported, and it had to be classified according to a specific set of criteria, including gross vehicle weight rating, and the configuration of the vehicle, as in whether it was a passenger vehicle, whether it was a truck, whether it was a van, whether it was heavy duty, light duty, medium duty, etc. Another example of an agency that classifies vehicles or equipment is the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And their purpose for classifying these types of equipment is really to establish regulations around emissions criteria for various types of engines, whether it be based on the size of the engine or whether it's a diesel engine versus a traditional gasoline type of engine. And then there are other sources of classification schemes for equipment that we can talk about, and I'll get into more detail as we get to that slide. So one of the challenges is, when we talk about equipment, we need a broad term that can include all of those various types of assets that were shown in the previous slide, like the over-the-snow equipment, material handling equipment, aviation support equipment, aerial work platforms, and those, agricultural tractors, those types of equipment. They all kind of fall into, a category of other, but we need to have something more definitive than that when we start talking about them, so that we are all having a common vocabulary. Next slide, please. So talking in further detail about the way that GSA utilizes federal supply classes, what we have up on the screen here are examples of the federal supply classes that include various types of heavy equipment and material handling equipment and airfield equipment, et cetera. So you can see the first category is airfield specialized trucks and trailers. And then we have low-speed tracked tractors. A tracked vehicle is like the one we saw that the Park Service is using on the snow, or that the Marine Corps is using out in Bridgeport, California, where it doesn't actually have wheels, but it rides on tracks, kind of like a bulldozer. Then we have wheeled tractors, high-speed, full-tracked tractors. I don't know what the differentiation is between low-speed and high-speed, but there's probably some breakpoint there. And then we have soil preparation, harvesting, earth moving and excavating, cranes, mining, road clearing, and then forklifts and warehouse trucks and those types of material handling equipment. Next slide, please. Now, more detail on the EPA regulations that cover different categories of equipment. They have what they generally or broadly term as non-road equipment. That's defined in the Code of Federal Regulations. Non-road equipment is equipment that is powered by non-road engines. It's kind of a self-describing definition. Non-road vehicle means a vehicle that is powered by a non-road engine. So they have two categories there. And then within the non-road category, EPA breaks it down further by application, whether these are aircraft engines, railroad type equipment that runs on fixed rails, marine, or small. And the reason they come up with a small category is that there are a lot of, I would say, engine-powered types of equipment out there that the federal government uses that are probably too small to rise to the level of being something that you would track in the same way as a large piece of equipment or an on-road vehicle. And what I mean by that is that you'll have small items like chainsaws and small residential type mowers or things of that nature that really they consume such a lower amount of fuel. Their maintenance costs are significantly less. Their acquisition costs are significantly less, that they just don't make sense to track them in the same way that you would track, for example, a crane that was lifting heavy loads on and off of a ship at a pier, for example. Next slide, please. So then there's also out there's a lot of informal terminology that's used to describe heavy equipment, and sometimes that can cause confusion. Some of the things that we hear is referred to as yellow fleet, yellow iron, yellow gear. And my colleagues and I were talking this morning, and just between the three of us that were on the phone call, we kind of all had different conceptions of what that meant. So those are commonly used to describe assets or equipment that is utilized in the construction industry, in the material handling industry, or in reference to flight line equipment. These are kind of slang or slang terms to differentiate from what some folks refer to as the white fleet, which are on-road assets, and the green fleet, which are taxable assets. So obviously, if somebody has a military background, then they might use one set of jargon to describe yellow iron or yellow fleet or yellow gear versus another person. And that could even differentiate between branches of service, as I found out this morning. So, in my conception, I was always thinking that yellow iron or yellow gear were construction equipment. And that's kind of colored by the fact that there are specific manufacturers like Caterpillar, Case, and Volvo that have traditionally always painted their equipment pretty much the same color of yellow. And but that term may be confusing for people that are unfamiliar with the industry when you start to talk about other types of or other brands of vehicles or equipment that are produced by other manufacturers, and part of their branding is the color of the equipment. So for example, Kubota produces a lot of construction equipment and agricultural equipment, and pretty much everything they build is orange, as well as John Deere. John Deere produces anything that's green is an agricultural tractor, anything that's yellow is made for Deere construction equipment. And Bobcat, I'm sure some folks probably recognize, those are traditionally all white. All their equipment is painted white. Next slide, please. So I talked about other sources of classification standards for equipment, and one of them is actually the National Association of Fleet Administrators. They have a classification standard that is used. It's a coding structure that covers non-self-propelled equipment like trailers, all the way through the various traditional classes that you hear about vehicles, like Class 1, Class 2, Class 3, all the way up through Class 8, which kind of align with the American Trucking Association standards, and also increase as the gross vehicle weight rating increases. And then you have at the other end of the scale what they call the off-road and construction equipment, which includes those off-road public works type assets, as well as material handling equipment, and essentially anything that doesn't run on the highway with wheels. Another association or industry association that has a standard in place for how to classify equipment is the American Public Works Association. Obviously, they're an organization that deals a lot with road maintenance, and so they have a classification standard for excavating equipment and the types of equipment that would be used for highway construction and maintenance. There's also an association, a professional association called the American Equipment Management Association that has their own standard, as well as the Federal Emergency Management Association. And FEMA is kind of an odd one to have their own standard, but if you think about it, FEMA is an organization that responds to disasters, and they do a lot of coordination between local jurisdictions that have equipment and the federal government. And where the classification comes into play is when these local government entities are seeking reimbursement for the costs of the recovery from FEMA. There has to be just as GSA publishes a rate table for agencies to pay for the use of GSA vehicles, FEMA publishes a rate table for them to use to reimburse agencies for their use of those vehicles. So there's a couple different standards in place, and some are more comprehensive than others, but those are some sources that if folks want to Google those later, they can probably find some interesting information out there. Next slide, please. So we're going to move into equipment fleet management, and we'll talk about some considerations that fleet managers should think about before they actually go out and purchase equipment, since equipment can be quite expensive. So before buying equipment, fleet managers should consider the overall demand for the equipment. It doesn't make any sense to go and source a piece of equipment if there's not really demand for it, especially considering that that this equipment can be extremely expensive. Some equipment can reach into hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars. And there really needs to be a demand for a piece of equipment if you're going to actually set aside the money to go buy that. Demand can be constant for certain types of equipment like forklifts, or it can be intermittent like paving equipment. Obviously, paving equipment is something that's typically seasonal, whereas forklifts are something that's usually probably used year-round in a warehouse environment. So there can be some differences there. Fleet managers should consider the required equipment response times. So some equipment may need to be on hand for unplanned events like water main breaks. If they have to do some excavation to get to the water main to repair it, nobody knows when a water main is going to break. So that means that they probably have to have the piece of equipment on hand. Therefore, that leans towards the organization buying that equipment. Whereas, if there are seasonal events like snow or something like that, what I've seen oftentimes is that, for example, here in the Washington, D.C. area, Metro will rent equipment for the duration of the winter and pre-stage it at Metro stations to help with snow removal. So they don't know when it's going to snow, but they can essentially provide that equipment in the wintertime when it's typically not being used by or rented by construction companies during the summertime. So they can probably get they can negotiate some cheaper rates for their equipment rentals because of that seasonal demand may be out of cycle. Fleet managers should also consider personnel qualifications before acquiring complex or potentially dangerous equipment. Some equipment can be dangerous in the hands of unqualified employees, or even if employees are qualified, when they only use that type of equipment intermittently. Next slide, please. So here's an example of what can happen with some of this heavy equipment that may be operated out there. It looks like this one is probably operating in a solid waste environment, and they drove the loader off the edge of a loading dock where they were probably loading, looks like mulch or something like that, off of the loading dock into some sort of hopper below, or maybe they had some vehicles would pull in below and they would fill them from above. Based on this kind of equipment and the location, it was probably an operator, I would assume, that had plenty of time at the controls, but probably had a momentary lapse of attention. Like I said, it's probably not an incidental operator that just jumped in that huge piece of equipment and decided they're going to go drive it that day. Conversely, one of the things, I guess this is more of, something that would be encountered in a material handling environment. Warehouse forklifts are the most dangerous kind of equipment out there. And there's a couple reasons for that. They're most often used by inexperienced or incidental operators. Somebody sees a forklift sitting there, they have something that they need moved. They may say, oh, I've seen people use this thing 100 times. It's no problem for me to jump on it and use it. And they can get themselves into real trouble, especially based on the handling characteristics of a forklift, with the steering wheels being in the rear, the fact that they're top heavy, and that an inexperienced operator doesn't know, certain handling characteristics when you have the load elevated or something like that. Additionally, they're dangerous because they're often used in areas with high pedestrian traffic and where there are narrow drive aisles. So this guy driving in this picture that was driving this big loader, probably pedestrians weren't much of an issue. It looks like he probably had a pretty wide open area other than the ledge. So that's a big difference in operating environment from somebody that might be using a forklift, in a warehouse or something like that. So one of the safety recommendations that we have is to always take the keys out of equipment when it's not in use, so that you avoid unauthorized use, especially by untrained personnel. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about utilization, where fleet managers should avoid retaining or replacing underutilized assets. If there are underutilized equipment assets in their fleet, they should probably look to get rid of them. And if they need that type of capability in the future, they should consider renting that asset or leasing it, or hiring or contracting out that service in order to get that job done. But probably not a good idea to buy an expensive asset just to have it sit around. Fleet managers should use various measures such as hour meter readings. This is different from on-road vehicles, which typically utilization is measured by odometer readings or distance. Since these off-road or material handling equipment types, their usage is not so much dictated by distance, but by how much the engine is running. They use what's called an hour meter. And that just measures how many hours of engine operation there were. Also, fleet managers should measure days of usage per month or per year, and have a utilization standard for minimum number of dispatches or minimum number of days of use, so that they're not buying, again, a vehicle that's just going to sit around and not be in use. Also, they should track cost per hour, which is a good measure to compare against rates for renting comparable equipment from the local market. Fleet managers should also consider other factors like work stoppage dependencies. And what I mean by that, so when a lack of availability causes other equipment or personnel to be affected, optimizing utilization becomes less important because that piece of equipment needs to be up and running in order for other pieces of equipment to be up and running. An example I'll use is when I worked in county government, we had rubber tire loaders or wheel loaders that we used to load salt in the back of dump trucks that would then go out and plow snow. So we'd have maybe 15 or 20 dump trucks working out of a depot and one loader. Well, if the one loader is not functioning, then you can't put salt in 15 or 20 dump trucks. That's what I mean by work stoppage dependency. So it's really important that we had good maintenance and good uptime on those loaders. And then also the lead time to provide substitute equipment. Okay, so in that example, if the loader goes down, is it possible to move another loader there from a different location in the middle of a snowstorm? Yes, it's possible, but there's going to be some lead time problems with that, but still doable. Next slide, please. So here's an example of poor utilization. Equipment utilization, demonstrating utilization is an important part of seeking fleet replacement funding. This is a picture that I took, and at this particular facility, a tractor loader was parked by the front gate for months at this facility without moving. It's a place that I drive by relatively frequently, and this is a federal agency, and they were using, it looks like somebody had driven a hole through the fence at the bottom of the fence and damaged it. And a concrete jersey wall was placed there, but they also left the tractor there for probably about 4 months before they actually moved it. Now, this is, I guess, kind of a rhetorical question for the audience, is if you were the fleet manager, how successful do you think you would be in asking for replacement funding for other equipment in your fleet when your site director sees that you're using this piece of equipment as a fence? And they see that on a day-to-day basis, day in, day out for months at a time. I can tell you that I'd probably be a little bit skeptical before I allocated money for fleet replacement if I saw that there were enough assets there that they could just be sitting around for months at a time without being used. Next slide, please. So fleet managers should also seek to reduce equipment downtime, which can be costly due to a lack of available backup equipment. They should stock adequate spare parts inventory for critical assets and minimize unplanned downtime through preventive maintenance. So preventive maintenance is obviously something that relies upon operators who should be trained on, perform, and document daily preventive maintenance checks and services. That's usually a driver's pre-trip inspection, might include checking fluids, using a grease gun, those types of things. Either technicians should receive training to maintain equipment, or maintenance service contractors should be in place in order to maintain that equipment. Fleet managers should develop preventive maintenance task lists and require that the task list be completed by maintenance personnel. That's an important thing. If a vehicle has an issue, you want to be able to track what was actually inspected on that vehicle to determine if those inspection points were sufficient to prevent any further breakdowns. Preventive maintenance task lists should be based on manufacturer's guidelines with adjustments made for in-service failures. If you see a particular item on a piece of equipment is always breaking, but there's not a PM check on it, and you can think of a PM check that would help to prevent that from breaking again, then that's something that you would add to the list. Apart from possibly being a legal requirement, regular equipment inspections are the first line of defense against breakdowns. And I have OSHA as an agency or an acronym that's listed there, Occupational Safety and Health Administration. OSHA has a lot of guidelines or requirements regarding the use of forklift trucks or forklifts or material handling equipment, since it's there are actually a lot of injuries or fatalities caused on an annual basis nationwide as a result of improper forklift use or unsafe forklift use. So that's an area that OSHA actually regulates and requires training for. Next slide, please. So let's talk about scheduled maintenance. Fleet managers should coordinate planned downtime with equipment users to minimize disruption. Again, we're talking about if we're maintaining seasonal equipment outside of the peak season. So those rubber tire loaders I was talking about, you might want to maintain those during the summer and bring them in the shop for preventive maintenance so that they're available in the winter and not out of service for PM at the same time that they're needed for snow removal operations. Fleet managers should consider using calendar-based preventive maintenance as opposed to meter-based preventive maintenance. And what I mean by that is we're going to say that in August we're going to do these PMs based on the calendar, rather than saying I'm going to PM this piece of equipment every 1,000 engine hours. The reason to do that is to increase control over shop scheduling, availability of spares, and planned downtime. Fleet managers should utilize key performance indicators like fleet availability and downtime, mean hours between failure, turnaround time, which is how long it takes to get a piece of equipment back out of the shop, and road calls or breakdowns. How often is that vehicle or a piece of equipment taken out of service because of an unplanned event? Fleet managers should also consider road service to maintain equipment in place to avoid transport costs and downtime. Can you send a service truck out and repair that equipment or inspect that equipment where it's sitting now, rather than transporting that equipment to your shop to do it? Those are important things to consider. Next slide, please. One of the things that many folks might not realize is that there are advances in connectivity for equipment, just as there are advances in connectivity for vehicles. So new equipment often arrives with built-in telematics devices, and they provide benefits in a variety of areas. So one of those areas is anti-theft or off-hours use or geofencing, which are important for equipment that may be left unattended on a job site that's either left there overnight, over the weekend, or it's a remote site where there may not be good security. A lot of, not necessarily in the federal government per se, but in the construction industry, a lot of equipment goes missing. It gets stolen. And it's a good idea for folks to have telematics devices so they can hopefully go recover that equipment, especially since it's not out on the road with license plates on it. It's a lot harder for folks to find and recover equipment when it does go missing. Telematics can provide utilization tracking, and one of the services when I actually purchased a bunch of loaders was that they came with telematics, but that the OEM dealership could also remotely troubleshoot or assist with troubleshooting fault codes for the loaders remotely, and could also help with maintenance scheduling. And what they would do is, as an added service, they would call us when the piece of equipment needed maintenance, and schedule service with us rather than us having to schedule service with them. And that was kind of a value add. They included the first few services with the purchase of the equipment. So that might be something that you all may run into when you acquire heavy equipment in the future. Equipment telematics have similar benefits to vehicle telematics, also with real-time visibility, tracking, and dispatching. And something that we have developed within Mercury, which is dynamic maintenance scheduling, which is really looking at how a piece of equipment is being used and customizing the maintenance plan and maintenance task lists around that equipment's use. Next slide, please. Another area where there's a difference between equipment and vehicles in the federal government is in reporting. On the left-hand side of the screen, we'll talk about federal reporting for other asset types. So there are systems in place for asset data to be reported to a centralized entity. And for agency aircraft, that reporting is done to something called the Federal Aviation Interactive Reporting System, or FAIRS. On an annual basis, or multiple times a year, there's input required, but it's generally on an annual cycle. Agency on-road vehicles have to report data to the Federal Automotive Statistical Tool, or via the Federal Automotive Statistical Tool, or FAST. And an area that probably most federal fleet managers not familiar with, but when I worked in local government in the transit environment, that transit agencies assets are tracked through the Federal Transit Administration and actually are tracked in much more detail than many federal equipment assets. So for example, the federal government provided us funding to purchase buses, but then we also had to report back how we were using the vehicles and other detailed information on a regular basis. Now on the right-hand side of the screen, federal reporting for equipment. Agency fleet management information systems should be used to track heavy equipment, but the requirement to do so is likely internal to the agency. I don't think there are any centralized requirements that I know of to use an FMIS. Next slide, please. So that covers it for my portion of the presentation. I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Fabian Cardona. Fabian, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everybody, or morning, wherever you're listening to us. And thank you again for being here with us today. The next couple of sections, I'm going to be covering own versus lease / rent. And I'm also going to be covering a GAO report. GAO is the Government Accountability Office. They published a report back in February, and we'll be going over those later slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so the big question is, when do you know if you should own or lease / rent a piece of equipment? If you are in the Department of Defense, then you should be aware that there are regulations that they ask you to prepare justification supporting a lease versus purchase decision. And this is to be if the vehicle is leased to be leased for more than 60 days. Now, which factors should we consider when we're going to do an own versus lease study? Or then the factors that we need to consider would be, how is your current situation? Do you have money saved for future purchases? Do you have to go and apply for loans? What's better for your current situation? How is your money doing? Next would be cost of, you have to know what the cost of ownership versus the cost of living would be, of leasing, I'm sorry. So we're going to go over this too. We're going to show you how to do both of those. And another one being aware of is how long the project is going to be and how often is this project going to take place. Then also, depending on the project length and frequency, you also have to know what the availability of this equipment is and how you're going to use the equipment. Next slide, please. Okay, so here on the left side, we're going to show you some pros of owning the equipment. And on the right-hand side, we're going to show you some for leasing or renting the equipment. When you own equipment, it can be sometimes less expensive over the long run as long as you're going to have a steady demand for that equipment. So if you know you're going to be using the equipment for paving roads and you're just going to use it throughout the year, then it would make more sense to own that piece of equipment than renting it over and over and over again. Second would be you can use the exchange and sale. Pretty much you can make money when you don't longer need the piece of equipment and you sell it. You recapitalize on the equipment. Next would be you will have more flexibility when you're using this type of the type of equipment that you need. So if you own the piece of equipment and you know that you're going to be using it for certain projects, you already know when to use it, and you can schedule that piece of equipment at the time and date and hours that you need to use it for. Now, if we look at the lease side, if you're just looking for one-time, two-time kind of use, then lease is going to be the way to go. Why? Because it's going to have a lower initial investment. You're not going to have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars buying a piece of equipment. Instead of you're just going to need the vehicle for 1 or 2 months, it's going to be a few $1,000s for leasing the equipment. You're also going to have access to the latest equipment offer for that type. You don't have to worry about maintenance, insurance, as this is going to be handled by another party. And also flexibility is going to come in place because there's going to be more places to source the equipment from. Next slide, please. All right, so federal agencies have different definitions for what is a lease and what is a rent. So in the Department of Defense, rental is anything that is less than 120 days. Anything that goes 120 days or more is considered a lease. Now, within the federal government, the DoD considers this to be lease or rent. And then if we're looking at other agencies such as the Department of Interior, they define a rental as a lease of less than a whole year. Now, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, FAR, governs the acquisition process for executive branch agencies. This means that under FAR, agencies should consider whether to lease equipment instead of purchasing it based on several factors. And these factors can be found under the 48 CFR 7.401. Next slide, please. Okay, so at the beginning, we were looking at the cost of ownership and cost of leasing or renting a piece of equipment. Here, we bring you a cost calculator, and this will enable you to make an informed decision of whether you need to rent or lease this piece of equipment or own it. Again, you know, we should go back and look at the factors that we covered previously, and then just run through the numbers and see what's going to make more sense when it comes down to your financial situation. So for renting, leasing, you're going to take the rental rate per year, month, or day, whatever that is that you are either renting the equipment for a year, month, or day, times the rental period in years, months, days that is going to be used. Then you're going to add whatever fees they're going to charge you for pickup and delivery, and this is going to give you a total cost for renting that vehicle. Now you grab the total rental cost, and you divide that by the rental period equal, and that's going to be equal your cost for whatever it is, the month or day or year. Now, once you find the total rental cost, and you divide that by the expected hours of use, and this is going to give you the total rental cost per hour of use. On On the owning side, it's pretty much the same. It's just we're going to take into consideration a couple more fees. We're going to look at how much the purchase cost of that one piece of equipment is. We're going to add it to whatever delivery or maintenance, insurance, and fees that you have, and this is going to give you the ownership cost. Now, to that, we're going to take what we believe we will get from the resale of the vehicle, and it's going to give you a total ownership cost. Now, we grab that total ownership cost, and we're going to divide that over the ownership period. And this is going to give you the ownership cost per year, month, or day. Now, when you grab that total ownership cost and you divide it by the expected use, hours of use, it's going to give you the ownership cost per hour of use. So then you can grab those two, the total rental cost per hour use, and compare that to the ownership cost per hour use. And whatever comes up more advantageous, then that's how it should go. Next slide, please. All right, so here, next slide. We're gonna cover the GAO report. This GAO report was, again, as I mentioned previously, was published back in February 2018. And it's a report that was done in the request of the Committee for Oversight and Government Reform in the House of Representatives. The title of the GAO report is Heavy Equipment. Selected agencies should improve guidance for purchases and leases vetted. And why are we looking at heavy equipment? Well, it's because the government is taking notice in how big heavy equipment is throughout the federal government. So they wanted to take a more in-depth look. So as Scott covered previously, they were trying to find out what is considered heavy equipment. They were trying to come up with their own terminology and define heavy equipment. Since they couldn't really find any terminology or definition, they went out and asked a few agencies and a fleet management consultancy agency and a rental company, and they came up with the federal supply codes that were used previously discussed by the federal supply classes previously discussed by Scott, and they were all in agreement that all those vehicles in those federal supply classes were considered heavy equipment. Next slide, please. So what is the reason for the GAO study? And this is straight from what the Committee of Oversight and Government Reform from the House of Representatives said. Federal agencies use a variety of heavy equipment such as cranes, backhoes, and forklifts to carry out their missions. This type of equipment can cost over $2 million per item. There is no government-wide information on how much heavy equipment agencies own, and there are no requirements for agencies to report on their ownership, use, or cost of equipment. This is in part due to the lack of a generally accepted definition of heavy equipment. As the government continues to seek opportunities to reduce costs, it is important to understand how agencies determine the need for heavy equipment and how their methods affect the cost of their heavy equipment fleet. Next slide, please. Okay, so the GAO went on to several federal agencies that use heavy equipment such as cranes, forklifts to carry out their missions, and they found out that there is no government-wide data on federal agencies on acquisition or management for this type of equipment. They also asked federal agencies to review the management of their heavy equipment, and among this report, one, they found that the number and type of cost of heavy equipment items that are owned by over 20 federal agencies, and two, the heavy equipment that selected agencies recently acquired, as well as how they decided whether to purchase or lease the equipment. GAO also collected heavy equipment inventory data. This was done as of June 2017 from 24 agencies that have chief financial officer responsible for overseeing financial management. These agencies, they discovered the practices were not generalizable to all acquisitions, but provide insight into what the efforts these agencies take to acquire thousands of heavy equipment items. So pretty much the slide right here is telling us that that there is no general way of for the agencies to be tracking their equipment, and since there is no reporting, it's pretty much all the agencies are out there are doing it their own way. Next slide, please. Okay, and on this slide, we're looking at the percentage of assets by agency. As we can see, the Department of Defense owns 74% of all the heavy equipment that was included in the data request for this study. And that rounds out to about 100,322 pieces of equipment. The Department of Veteran Affairs has about 5%, or about 6.2 thousand items. Department of Interior has about 6.3 thousand items. Department of Agriculture has about 9,000 pieces of equipment. And other agencies is about 11%, or about 14.5 thousand pieces of equipment. Next slide, please. So here in this slide, we can see the acquisition costs for all these equipment. Again, the Department of Defense with 100,322 pieces of equipment totals to $5.297 million, and this is dollars from 2016. So it will probably be a little more in 2018/19 dollars. The Department of Agriculture with $404 million worth of equipment. And if we go down the line, the grand total for the entire federal heavy equipment fleet would be a total number of 136,329 items with a price tag of $7.430 million. Next slide, please. Okay, so what types of equipment are we talking about? So 38% of the biggest slice of the pie here is all construction, mining, excavating, and highway maintenance equipment at 51.908 pieces of equipment. Next is going to be airfield specialized trucks and trailers with over 33,000 pieces of equipment. At 22%, we'll find self-propelled warehouse trucks and tractors, including forklifts and little tugs. And that's about 29,602 pieces of equipment. And then there's going to be tractors at 13%. And finally, with just at 3%, is going to be soil preparation and harvesting equipment. Next slide, please. So these are the findings from the study. GAO is found that agencies should improve guidance for purchases and leases. Pretty much they're recommending for agencies to come up with guidance on when they should purchase or lease the equipment. Second, of the 24 agencies included in the study, 20 reported owning over 136,000 pieces of equipment valued at $7.5 billion. 4 agencies reported not owning any heavy equipment. Based on Mercury's observation and the GAO study, all heavy equipment are not fully reported and accounted for in property or fleet management information systems. Then 3 of the selected agencies spent $360 million on purchases of about 3,500 pieces of heavy equipment items. From those, the officials did not constantly conduct or documented any lease versus purchase analysis. and some agencies claim that there was no clarity on when such analysis needed to be performed. Next slide, please. So out of the entire study, the GAO produced one recommendation, which was for agencies to develop guidance to clarify the circumstances in which lease versus purchase analysis for heavy equipment acquisitions are to be conducted and documented. Next. Okay, our takeaways from this study was that there is no generally accepted definition of heavy equipment, meaning we also need to sit down at the table and come up with a general terminology for heavy equipment. What is heavy equipment? 2, there are gaps that exist in data accountability and guidance. 3, if the federal management information, the FMIS usage for equipment is low, it calls for questioning to agencies' ability to track preventive maintenance and equipment costs. So if we're not tracking equipment utilization in our fleet management information system, there is no way for agencies to have the ability to see when the maintenance is to be performed or how much is actually the equipment costing the agency. Next. So us in Mercury recommend to develop equipment data, cost tracking, and inventory capabilities. For example, tracking all this information into your fleet management information system. As Scott mentioned before, it's very important for you to be tracking your utilization correctly, as this translates into forecasting and managing your maintenance, which in turn, if you can keep track of your management and your utilization, it can turn into savings or actually coming ahead in your finances. Develop preventive maintenance programs. Very important for you to keep up these pieces of equipment up to date with their maintenance. Next, develop key performance indicators for equipment management, such as utilization rates, out of service rates, etc. Evaluate equipment utilization through a structured process, which will be similar to the vehicle allocation methodology, or what also known as VAMS, for on-road assets. And finally, analyze your life cycle cost and develop long-term fleet replacement plans. Next. That is it. So now we're going to open up the floor for questions. Do we have any questions out there?
I am not seeing any questions in our chat window at this moment, but if anyone has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand or put a question here in the chat window. Can give it a minute. Want to say thank you first off to Scott and Fabian both for presenting today. Lots of great information.
Well, thank you. We appreciate the opportunity to present this information. I think it's definitely important to get it out there because this is an often overlooked area of fleet management.
Yes, if you all can think of anything else, our contact information is on the screen right now. So if you come up with any questions later on, don't hesitate to shoot me an email.
Okay, I'm not seeing any questions at this moment. So I will go ahead and just say thanks Again, Scott and Fabian, I hope everyone has a great rest of their Tuesday. And hopefully we will see you for the next Fleet Management Awareness Month webinar next week. So go ahead and on to the MPMA website, register for that one. I believe it's next Wednesday, and we will see you then. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thanks, everybody.